This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story.
Hey, Storyworks writers, if you're enjoying the podcast, we would love it if you could head over to wherever you get your podcasts and leave us an awesome review.
Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today, Robert, Catherine, and I are thrilled to be joined by author Talia Carner. Talia is an activist, a feminist, and a humanitarian who gives voice to those without a voice. A New York-based author, she is unafraid to tackle controversial issues in her psychological suspense novels that bring to the forefront indignities and atrocities long ignored. Her novels include Puppet Child, China Doll, Jerusalem Maiden, Hotel Moscow, and newly released by HarperCollins, The Third Daughter. Welcome, Talia. We're excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. I love being on your program.
Oh, thank you. And if anyone missed it, go back to last week's show. Talia and I had a conversation about The Third Daughter, going in depth into this amazing story of a young Jewish girl from Russia who was tricked into sex slavery in Argentina. Now, today we're going to talk about how stories find us. And Talia, I'm going to ask you that question first.
Well, thank you for having me on your show. And I very often at parties, somebody would come over and say, let me tell you my story because it's very interesting. And I say, go ahead and write your own story. No, I want you to write it and then we'll split the profit 50-50. So my answer is just take your writing courses and just go ahead and do it. The stories, I found that each one of my novels had seeds in decades sometimes before. Mm-hmm. There were issues that had either interfered in my life or had come to my consciousness way before the book actually exploded out of me and forced me to sit down and write it. Mm-hmm. So I don't find myself in a situation where I'm done with a novel and I sit down and say, okay, now what am I going to do? How am I going to come up? And I really don't know I know if authors have written 10, 20, 30 books. I'm not sure if I ever be there. Mine is only my 5th, and I'm researching my 6th. I just know that just like the 6th book just came to me, we were traveling in France, and I saw a road sign, and I said, that reminds me of something. And I started reading about it, and since then in 3 years, I made already 4 trips back to France. To research that. But so the story found me because of a road sign. It doesn't take much. Sometimes it's a passing remark by somebody. It's a few words that are being said by a reader. Jerusalem Maiden came because a reader wrote to me about another book that she was reading that had been based in Jerusalem. And I had the same book with me in Hebrew, and I said to her, how about if the two of us read it at the same time and discuss it? And when we discussed it, I realized that she had profoundly did not know stuff that I knew that came from my grandmother's life, and I was inspired. So I ended up writing that book that I wanted, that came from this just one question. Do you know that particular book? And here we go. I wrote another one. So, so that's how stories find me. And inspiration is strange. It's just comes there.
Right. I love how you said the stories explode. Like they're bursting to be written. What is Jerusalem Maiden about, can you give us a little brief synopsis and tell us a little more about that nugget of inspiration?
Jerusalem Maiden was my third novel that got published in 2011. The background is a young woman, also adolescent, prepubescent. She's about 14 years old. And at that time, they married girls off very young, before puberty, in order to hasten the Messiah's arrival.
Mm.
And she discovers her extraordinary talent for art, but it's against the second commandment: thou shalt not make any graven images.
Mm.
And in Judaism, that commandment was taken very seriously, literally, and there was never development of visual art in Judaism. They had calligraphy. They used just to decorate something with leaves and maybe branches of trees, but otherwise complete landscapes, definitely not animals or rocks, mountains. All of these were pagan symbols, what pagans used to worship in biblical times. So she struggles with that. She says to God, and she has direct relationship with God, not necessarily through the hierarchy of the organized religion. And she says, why did you give me this talent if you don't want me to see the world? She sees the world in a different way than the rest of people around her. So she keeps on asking. She has this lifelong struggle between herself and God, between her faith and her passion to create, which is breaking supposedly his words. So that's the book. Now, that's the first 2 pages, okay? And then as time goes by, there are a lot of things happen in her life, and we find her in 1924. She's then about 24 years old. She's already married. She already has 3 children, but she comes into herself when she left God in the Holy Land, and now finds ways to express herself in art, in love, in coming to terms with herself. But at the end, in her struggle with God, guess who wins? God. So I'm not going to, of course, tell the whole story, but it's a book that it's my bestseller. It's my 3rd book, but was my bestseller. And hopefully this one, my publisher, HarperCollins, my editor at HarperCollins, think that the 3rd daughter is the challenge to supremacy of Jerusalem in my records of book sales and reviews. We'll see. It takes courage, and that brings me back also to the inspiration. It's not enough to have inspiration. For me, it took tremendous amount of courage to deal with each one of my subjects. Believe me, like China Doll, which deals with infanticide in China. It was published in 2006. I'm still banned from China. My claim to fame, I cannot travel.
Wow.
So, but that was not the part that took courage. What took courage is to visit, in my mind, an orphanage where they kill babies. So that kind of ability to go into that situation. I was just reading a book that a writing friend asked me to blurb, and I politely did not, because she gets into an interesting situation. Somebody was arrested, and then the next morning he comes back and we barely hear about it. She was afraid as an author to go into the situation. that's the courage I require of myself. Write it. Then maybe you may edit, you may bring it down to in a way that the reader can accept, and it's not going to be. I do write heart-wrenching, but even within heart-wrenching, it could be so impossible that you just close the book and you don't want to read it again. Which the third daughter is very close to challenging that level. Or you may continue, but you need to have the courage to go into the situation with the protagonist. Or if this happened to be a side character, but we need to know what happened there. It's not like the next morning you come and you drink coffee and a croissant with nothing happened if the guy had been arrested the night before. It turns out it was a case of racism. Well, we need to know what happened. What did the cops do? What was he charged with? So that courage is part of taking the inspiration to its fullest.
Talia, are you aware of your themes when you're in that sort of first compositional mode when you're drafting, or does it strengthen over time? Because you've taken the kernel of an idea and then that's blossomed into something. I must write this and it must explode out of my mind. How does that happen? Are you very conscious of what it is that you're writing to during the time, or does it strengthen over time, or a bit of both? Can you talk a bit about that?
Probably somewhat both. On one hand, I get into a trance, like a dream.
Yes.
Where I see the sights and hear the sounds, and I actually write the dialogue that I hear going on. I watch the room like I'm watching them all on stage. At the same time, the dream is illogical and move you around too much. So in that respect, I'm pretty conscious of the storyline, even not completely. I may write something extra that I eventually decide to cut off. I remember my very first novel, I had one of the three main characters, because the story goes through around 3 point of view characters. This was a young man. The novel is Puppet Child, and there was a judge, a mother who was fighting to save her daughter from the father's molestation, and the young law clerk who works for the judge but befriends the young mother. And I ended up going with him to visit his mother on Sunday afternoon, and I ended up going to the beach with him. It took me places that were really not necessary for the story. That does not happen anymore. On the other hand, I don't plot. I have a friend, a writer, Andrew Gross, who's now just published his 19th book in 19 years. So a book a year, a top New York Times bestseller, suspense books. He outlines in about 60 pages outline before he begins to write the book. I don't outline even 2 pages. I don't know what's going to happen. I have no idea, because just like the dream, I am with the protagonist in the situation, and I keep on going. Well, that's why Andrew Gross finishes a book in a year, and it takes me 5 years. It could be other reasons as well, but it's just doesn't work for me. I once tried to outline and then fill up the blanks and just expand on each paragraph or each scene, and it just doesn't work for me.
Do you have an idea of where you're heading? Do you have, or maybe different for the different books, of course. So you might not know what happens during the story, but do you have a sense of the climactic moment or where your protagonist is going to end?
It's funny. You've heard that probably before, the analogy that writing a novel is like leaving New York, driving from New York to California, living at night. you know your final destination, but you can only see as far as the headlights.
Right.
Okay, so that is very true for me in very general, meaning depends on the book. The book, my book number 6, I have no idea. Even I don't even know what's the story. I know the historical background of what happened and what's the theme. Why is it important to me? I know, but I
Lovely.
know what.
Lovely.
And I have the protagonist, but I don't know why she's going to go on the road and so on. Anyway, I remember in China Doll in particularly, I encountered that I don't know China, and here my protagonist gets lost in China. So I was going to take. I got my husband and another couple to agree to take a trip to China with me. And I contacted, and I know where my protagonist was traveling within China in general. China is huge. I contacted a few travel agents, and no one would take me to that area because no one I mean, this is huge. This is from Shanghai all the way to, from Beijing, I believe, all the way to Taiwan or something. I mean, it's huge part of China. No one would take me there. Goes back to around the year 2000 that I researched it, 2004 maybe. But my point is that they kept telling me it's too dangerous. There were no hotels there. They are pirates may attack us. Well, that's all I needed to know. So now, so I rented movies set in China. And regardless of what they were talking about, didn't matter. And I just looked at the sites, the kind of flora and fauna, the kind of trees, whatever it is that was happening in that area. And now I was going to do it in one chapter, taking her from one place to another. She ended up doing it over 5 chapters because now that I knew that it was dangerous, other things came and happened along the way because it was dangerous.
Fantastic. I love it.
So that's the not planning, but going with the flow in that respect.
Yeah.
But I knew that she had to get to, I don't think it was Taiwan. I'm sorry, it's my own book, but I have many books later.
It's in the wild. It's okay.
But I know she had to get to the South China Sea to, I think it was Taiwan, where she had to find her way there and make her way to the American embassy. So that's how that went. Yeah, it's hard. I envy people who can see the entire book. I must say that writers who write pure suspense have, it's a different talent. I can't say other than I admire them greatly. Mine is a psychological suspense. It's the emotions. I get the reader and I don't let go, but it's emotional. I have another analogy for that. You know how a comedian get on stage and he or she has 30 seconds to grab the audience with it. So, and then has to continue to ratchet, but then has to drop it a little bit and then go up higher. So the laughter continues to grow. I have a similar challenge. I have to grab the reader in the first paragraph, or they say the first sentence, the first paragraph, first page, first few pages, first chapter. I don't know when she's going to fall asleep on me, but she is going to fall asleep, right? This is usually people read it very often at night, and they sleep. The book drops on the floor along with the slippers. The next day she wakes up, she has to run to work. Her mother calls her, they have a fight on the phone, her boss is impossible. She gets a call from the school nurse that her child had gashed his chin, and then she rushes and her car overheats in traffic, and all kind of bad things happen all day long. And all through that day, I want her to think, about my book and what happened, what's happening next. And what she wants more than all of these things, she can't forget, she wants to get back to the book tonight and pick it up again. And I don't know where was the spot where she left it. So it has to be emotionally compelling at every point, even as if it's the moment where in the third daughter, she dances tango. You want to know, who is this man she's dancing tango with? He's not just anybody. There's always something in it that you want to get back to.
Yes. And do you find as the writer that you experience that same excitement while you're crafting it for the reader? Are you excited to get back into the story yourself and find out what's beyond that headlight beam?
Yes. Not only that, every time the reader is surprised, I was surprised. I didn't know this was going to happen. I'm in the scene and I'm traveling with her, and all of a sudden a hand comes out of the sky and yanks the story into a new orbit. I don't know if this was going to happen. So for me, those are great surprises. In Jerusalem Maiden, it happened in interesting ways. It happened in Hotel Moscow in interesting ways. So I can't give all the stories. And of course, in the third daughter that we are discussing now, I didn't know a lot of things that were going to happen. And sometimes I need to continue my research. And the research brings me no idea, oh, this is what happened historically. I can use that. So I found, for example, in the third daughter, that in my research, I found out about Teatro Colón, which is huge opera house in the center of Buenos Aires that had been built designed by a French architect, and that's why it looks like the opera house in Paris. The Paris Opera, not the opera house. There are different opera buildings in Paris, as expected, but this one is closer to the Champs-Élysées. And I found out that they were, through my research, that the reopening, because the benefactor had died, and the construction stopped for about 20 years until the city of Buenos Aires found another source to finish the job. Guess what was the source? Tzvi Migdal, the union, pimps of union. They obviously exploited these women that they were working for them, which I can tell you, it's not in any publicity material today of Teatro Colón of how the building was
funded.
Funded, yes.
Okay, but I found out that the opening performance was Aida. So now I bring her and the story of Aida, who had been an enslaved woman captured by Egyptian army, and her father is coming in, and the general who captivated her actually falls in love with her. But anyway, it brings back now to the story of the third daughter. She can now hang on the story of Aida, who is a slave woman being captured. This is by complete coincidence that I found. But it plays right into the story.
Right into the theme, yeah.
It does. Fantastic. It's amazing. You would think that that's poetic license, that you picked Aida to go into this story because of those connections, but here it's actual historical fact that the Union of Pimps in Argentina funded the opera house, and that was, in fact, the opening show.
Yes. And I must say also, talking about historical fiction, and I didn't study how to do historical fiction, so maybe what I'm going to say is not exactly in the how-to books. But My story takes place, in this particular case is 1895, for example, 1895. The reopening of the opera was, I believe, in 1904 or 06, meaning it happened really 8 years later. So if I were that opening, the Aidas, okay? If I were to write a nonfiction book, I would have to stay exactly on the dates. If this 1895, I can't say that Aida played. But I wrote in the opening of the book that the events are correct. They happen within a decade, because it doesn't really matter to the fictional story,
right,
that this actually happened a few years, maybe 7-8 years later than my real timeline. But that's okay for a historical fiction when it's not like you can't change the date that World War II broke.
right.
You can adjust that to fit your story, but you could do something that's a matter of texture. And I gave myself the liberty when I write fiction to use the cultural background to bring in for texture, for feeling, for environment.
Right. Yes, I love that idea of using fact as texture in our fiction instead of being so rigidly confined with minor details, things that add color.
I love how Talia notices things. She's obviously a very keen student of life and notices things that then prompt. It's almost as if it pops into the theme and then acts as a writing prompt that then allows her to connect this web of richness to the story. It's fabulous. I'm really enjoying listening to it.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Storyworks Roundtable with author and activist Talia Carner. We continue this conversation next week with part 2. And if you're enjoying the show, remember to give us a rating and a review at iTunes or wherever you get your podcast. It's the best way you can show us your support. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Storyworks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.